October 24th, 1929, a Thursday. Nobody called it Black Thursday yet. That name would come later, written in headlines, whispered in kitchens, carved into the memory of a nation. But at 10 a.m. on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, something broke. Not a window, not a machine, something bigger. Confidence. In less than 2 hours, 13 million shares changed hands. A number so large, the ticker tape could not even keep up. It ran hours behind real time. Men were shouting prices that no longer existed. Fortunes were vanishing faster than anyone could write them down. Outside, on Wall Street, a crowd began to gather, silent, frozen, watching the windows of the stock exchange like people watching a house burn down, a house they used to live in. Somewhere in that crowd was a shoeshine boy. Just weeks earlier, he had been giving stock tips to his customers. Now he stood in silence, watching men in $1,000 suits go pale. Police were even called to Wall Street that morning. Not because of violence, but because the crowd of stunned onlookers had grown so large, so unnervingly quiet, that officials feared what silence like that might turn into. This was the moment America stopped feeling invincible, and by the time the dust settled, this single moment would help trigger disaster, not just that day, but over the years that followed. The worst economic disaster in American history. Banks would close, families would lose their homes, children would go to bed hungry. In the richest country on earth, I'm Phoenix historian, and for the last 5 years I've been digging through the letters, the testimonies, and the numbers behind America's darkest financial hour. Not the version you read in a textbook, the version that was actually lived, in diaries, in newspaper clippings gone yellow with age, and in the shaky handwriting of people who never expected to lose everything. Because to understand how America nearly lost everything, we have to go back to the moment it thought it had won everything. Stay with me until the very end, because what happened after the crash is just as powerful as the fall itself. How a broken nation clawed its way back from the edge. That is the other half of this story. Picture America in the summer of 1929. The war is over. The factories are humming. Radios are playing in living rooms across the country. They bring music and news into homes that had never heard a voice from hundreds of miles away. Cars, once a luxury only the wealthy could dream of, are rolling off assembly lines by the millions. All thanks to a young manufacturing method called the production line. Skyscrapers are rising in New York, like monuments to a new American religion, progress. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and it roared for a reason. Wages were up. Consumer goods were everywhere. Refrigerators, washing machines, radios, all suddenly within reach of the average family, and Wall Street was the beating heart of it all. The stock market was not just a place for bankers anymore. It had become a national obsession, a kind of national lottery that everyone believed they could win. Taxi drivers were trading stocks between fares. Barbers gave tips between haircuts. Housewives pooled grocery money to buy shares of companies they had never heard of a year earlier. Everyone, it seemed, was getting rich, or about to. Newspapers ran stories of ordinary secretaries turning a few $100s into small fortunes almost overnight. The message was everywhere. You would be a fool not to invest. President Herbert Hoover himself had promised the country was closer than ever to abolishing poverty for good. And why would people not believe it? The stock market had been climbing for years, not slowly, explosively. Between 1921 and 1929, stock prices had multiplied several times over. People were not just investing anymore. They were gambling on tomorrow, mortgaging their homes, borrowing against their life insurance, betting everything on the belief that the market simply could not fall. And when everyone believes tomorrow can only get better, nobody stops to ask the dangerous question: what happens if it does not? Here is what most people do not know. What the shiny surface of the 1920s hid underneath. Much of that wealth was not real. It was borrowed. There was a practice on Wall Street called buying on margin. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple and dangerous. Instead of paying the full price for a stock, you could put down just a small percentage, sometimes as little as 10%. The rest, you borrowed. From your broker, from the bank, from anyone willing to lend. And in 1929, plenty of people were willing. It meant an ordinary person could buy $100 of stock with just $10 in their pocket. As long as prices kept rising, this felt like magic. Free money, seemingly conjured out of thin air. But debt is never free. It is a promise, and promises come due. Because if the price of that stock ever dropped, even a little, the broker would demand the rest immediately. This was called a margin call. And if you could not pay, they sold your stock, instantly, whether you wanted them to or not, wiping out your investment in the time it took to answer the phone. By the fall of 1929, billions of dollars in stock had been bought this way, on nothing but borrowed faith. The entire market had become a tower built on debt, standing tall only because everyone agreed not to look down. Bankers saw warning signs. A few economists raised alarms. They warned that stock prices had become disconnected from the real value of the companies behind them. But the money was too good. The mood was too intoxicating. Almost nobody wanted to stop and ask hard questions. Confidence, it turns out, is the most dangerous currency of all. Because when it runs out for everyone, all at once. And in October 1929, it did. Black Thursday, October 24th. This was the first crack. The panic selling we described at the very beginning of this video. Shares were dumped by the millions. Investors were suddenly terrified. They tried to sell before prices fell any further, which, of course, only made prices fall faster. Prices collapsed. A group of powerful bankers rushed in. They were led by men from J.P. Morgan and Co. They bought stocks publicly, hoping the sight of confident money flowing back into the market would calm the panic. It worked. For a moment. The market steadied. Newspapers the next day even reported it as a controlled correction, a hiccup, nothing more. They were wrong. Black Monday, October 28th. The bankers did not come to the rescue this time. Maybe they could not. Maybe they would not. Maybe even they understood by now that no amount of money could stop what had begun. And without that safety net, the market fell harder than the day before. Nearly 13% of the market's total value disappeared in a single day. Just one day. Fortunes that had taken decades to build vanished before the sun went down. And all across the country, families faced a terrifying new reality. Families who had gone to bed wealthy the night before woke up wondering how they would pay next month's rent. Black Tuesday, October 29th. This was the day the illusion died completely. Over 16 million shares traded hands, a record that would stand for nearly 40 years. The ticker tape ran so far behind that some investors did not even know they were ruined. Not until hours after it happened. They walked around for most of the afternoon believing they still had money. But in truth, that money no longer existed. Stories from that day still send chills down the spine. Grown men openly weeping on the floor of the exchange. Crowds gathering outside, not to protest, just to watch, in stunned disbelief, as their life savings turned into worthless paper right in front of them. There's a persistent myth that Wall Street bankers leapt from windows that week. Historians have found little evidence this happened on a large scale. But the myth itself tells us something important. People believed it because it felt true, because the despair was that real, that total, that suffocating. By the end of that week, the stock market had lost billions in value. Wealth that had taken years to build was erased in a matter of days. And that was only the beginning. We tend to think of the crash as a Wall Street story. Bankers, brokers, and rich men in tall buildings losing money most of us could never imagine having. But the real story, the one that matters, happened far from Wall Street. It happened in small towns, farming communities, immigrant neighborhoods, and working-class homes. Families who had never bought a single share of stock in their lives. People who had never even set foot near the New York Stock Exchange. Because when the market fell, it did not just take money with it. It took jobs, it took homes, it took hope. And it would take years before it gave any of that back. Here is something the crash did not cause directly. But it triggered it, like the first domino in a long, painful chain. Banks across America had taken people's savings and invested a portion of it, some safely, some recklessly, and some directly in the stock market. When the market crashed, a wave of fear followed. It spread from town to town like wildfire. People rushed to their local banks, desperate to pull out their money before it disappeared too. This was called a bank run. But banks did not keep all that cash sitting in a vault. They were not waiting for everyone to ask for it back at once. Much of the money had already been loaned out to homeowners, to businesses, and to farmers. So when thousands of people demanded their money on the same day, the banks simply could not pay. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed across the United States. 9,000. That means millions of ordinary Americans lost everything they had saved. Teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, widows who had spent a lifetime saving a few $100s. They opened their bank's doors one morning and found a sign nailed to the front. Closed. Their life savings were gone. Not stolen. Not lost in some risky gamble of their own. Just gone. Because the system built to protect that money had collapsed. And nobody had ever promised to make them whole again. Unemployment soared. By 1933, roughly 1 in 4 American workers had no job at all, a number almost impossible to imagine today. Factories shut their gates, construction stopped. Stores closed one by one on main streets across the country. Their windows were boarded up. Their owners were often just as broke as the customers who used to shop there. Families who once owned homes now lived in makeshift camps, camps built from scrap wood and tin. They were bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, a dark joke aimed at a president who had promised prosperity and delivered poverty instead. In cities, long lines of men stood for hours outside soup kitchens. Some wore suits, some wore work clothes. Many had once been proud providers for their families. Just a few years earlier, some might have been the ones giving to charity. Now they were lining up for it themselves, clutching their hats, ashamed to make eye contact with strangers standing beside them in the same line. And then, as if the nation had not suffered enough, nature turned against it too. In the plains of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, years of overfarming had weakened the land. Farmers had stripped the soil of the grass and roots that once held it together. Then came the drought. Years of it, relentless and unforgiving. Without rain and without roots, the topsoil turned to dust. And when the winds came, they did not just blow. They carried entire farms into the sky. Massive black clouds of dirt rolled across the horizon like something out of a nightmare. Some rose over 10,000 feet high. They blotted out the sun in the middle of the afternoon. People called them black blizzards. Families sealed their windows with wet cloth and still woke to find dust coating their beds, their food, and their children's lungs. Some children developed a sickness doctors began calling dust pneumonia. This was the Dust Bowl, an environmental catastrophe layered directly on top of an economic one, as if the country was being tested from every direction at once. Farmers who had survived the crash now watched their land turn against them. Many had no choice left but to pack whatever they could carry and head west, hoping for work, hoping for rain, hoping for anything better than what they were leaving behind. Entire families crowded into old trucks. They drove toward California with everything they owned tied to the roof, only to arrive and find thousands of others had made the same journey, with the same hope, chasing jobs that simply did not exist for all of them. Hunger, homelessness, dust in the lungs of children. This was America in the early 1930s. The nation that once boasted it was about to eliminate poverty forever, now needed saving. If this story is hitting you the way it hits me every time I research it, take a second. Hit subscribe to the Phoenix Archive. We do not just tell you what happened in history, we show you how it felt to live through it. Because understanding the past is the only way to recognize the warning signs of the future. And trust me, this story still is not over. What happens next is the part most documentaries rush through, but it is the part that actually explains how America survived at all. Stay with me. By 1932, the country was desperate for change. And it found that change in a man who promised something the previous administration never could. Hope with a plan attached. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide. And in his first inaugural address, he spoke words still quoted today, that the only thing to fear was fear itself. But Roosevelt did not just offer comforting words. He offered action. Fast, sweeping, and unprecedented action. It became known as the New Deal. Within his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt pushed through a wave of emergency reforms. Few presidents in American history have matched that pace, before or since. He declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the country. It sounds strange, closing banks to fix a banking crisis. But the goal was to stop the panic, inspect which banks were actually stable, and reopen only the ones that could be trusted. It worked. Confidence slowly began to return, painfully, one reopened bank at a time. Then came the reforms designed to make sure this could never happen again. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, known today as the FDIC. It guaranteed that if your bank failed, the government would still protect your savings, up to a certain amount. For the first time, ordinary Americans did not have to fear losing everything overnight. Not because of decisions made by bankers they never met. Not because of risks they never agreed to. The Securities and Exchange Commission was formed to regulate Wall Street itself, known today as the SEC. Its purpose was to make reckless speculation harder and to expose the hidden risks that had fueled the crash. So they could not operate in the shadows again. But Roosevelt's New Deal went beyond the financial system. It put people back to work directly. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps employed millions of Americans. So did the Works Progress Administration. They built roads, planted forests, constructed bridges, built dams, and raised public buildings that still stand today. Silent monuments to a generation that refused to simply wait for rescue. It was not a magic fix. The Depression did not end overnight. And for millions of families, the hardship dragged on for years, even as these programs began to take shape. In truth, it would take the economic demands of World War II, years later, to fully pull America out of the downturn. But something more important than economic numbers began to recover in those years. Belief. The belief that the government had not abandoned its people, and that the country had not abandoned them either. Families who had lost everything slowly began to rebuild, one paycheck at a time, one harvest at a time, one reopened storefront at a time. Communities broken by bank failures and Dust Bowl wins found new footing through public works, new protections, and sheer human endurance. America did not recover because the crisis simply passed. It recovered because people refused to give up, and because, this time, the system was rebuilt differently, built to catch people instead of crushing them. Here is what haunts me most after 5 years of researching this story. The crash of 1929 was not caused by one villain, not one bad decision, not one corrupt banker sitting behind a desk somewhere. It was caused by something far more human, overconfidence, the belief that prosperity, once achieved, could never end. the refusal to ask hard questions when the money was flowing and when the mood was good, when everyone around you seemed to be getting richer, and asking questions felt like the only foolish thing left to do. Sound familiar? Every generation since has faced its own version of this same warning. 2008, different decade, different details, but the same core mistake, mistaking borrowed confidence for real stability. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes. And if we stop listening to those rhymes, we are doomed to relearn the same painful lessons. Lessons our grandparents and great-grandparents already paid for. In breadlines, in dust storms, and in bank doors that never reopened. The story of the 1929 crash is not just about Wall Street, or banks, or a president trying to fix a broken country. It is about what happens to ordinary people when the system they trust is built on sand, and what it takes, as a nation, to rebuild something sturdier from the wreckage. That rebuilding took reform. It took resilience. It took people who refused to let despair become permanent, people who lined up for soup and still got up the next morning looking for work. If there is one thing this story teaches us, it is this. Even the richest, most powerful nation on earth can fall, and fall hard, faster than anyone believed possible, but it can also rise again, if it is willing to learn from the fall, instead of simply waiting for the next one to arrive. I'm Phoenix historian, and this has been another deep dive from the Phoenix Archive, where we do not just retell history, we uncover it, one archive, one testimony, one forgotten detail at a time. If this story moved you, subscribe. If it made you see 1929, not as a date in a textbook, subscribe. If it made you see it as something real, something human, something that can still teach us today, subscribe so you never miss the next chapter we bring back from the archive. Because the past is not finished with us yet, and neither are we with it.